he's the guy that was the one who interpolated Josephus. And where does that come from? What's the deal? What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So he knows Porphyry's writings. It's easy to imagine that he and Porphyry could have actually been in the same place at the same time. Certainly he knows Neoplatonist writings. He has a couple of bits of Plotinus. He knows Porphyry to Origen, of course, and Origen seems to have a close connection with these early Neoplatonist circles. He knows others as well, figures like Ammonius. No, and connecting Agamemnon's sacrifice of his daughter with Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac as well. Yeah, no, these sorts of connections are noted by figures like Eusebius. They're even noted by non-Christians in the period who often will want to put the arrow of dependence the other way and say, oh, yeah, Jewish literature, Christian literature is borrowing from Homer, is borrowing from Greek literature. Recognizing these sorts of parallels, the impulse to see parallels whenever possible, but it's a broader phenomenon, this imperial mode of knowledge. As Rome's empire expands, there's this really fascinating cultural project of trying to organize the histories, cultures, including cults, and literatures of these various peoples into some sort of systematic imperial way of knowing. And so this is part of a broader argument that sees all of human history and culture as manifesting a sort of divine teleology that leads toward Jesus and toward Christian truth and wisdom.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And today I'm with Jeremiah Coogan, author of Eusebius the Evangelist, rewriting the Fourfold Gospel in late antiquity. And you can find him on Twitter as well. And if I'm not mistaken, you're teaching right now as a professor?
Yes, yeah. I teach in Berkeley, California at the Jesuit School of Theology.
Wow, incredible. So we have a bona fide expert in front of us, and this is going to be great. I'm looking forward to this conversation. This is a topic that Eusebius, he's such an interesting character. And for me, what makes him so interesting is actually this it's not the church history, it's this one, preparation for the Gospels.
Yeah.
And what was this guy doing without the internet, and how did he know all this stuff? Because he's like every page is just full of knowledge. Like he's talking about Porphyry, he's talking about the Phoenician history, he's talking about the Egyptians, he's talking about the Babylonians. He's all over the place. He just knows everything. And does he live in a library? Like, so let's get into Eusebius. And is he an evangelist? And how does he transform Christian scholarship, basically?
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah. No, Eusebius is so much fun to think about. Eusebius, of course, was a 4th century Christian scholar and bishop. He lived in Caesarea Maritima in what was then Roman Palestine, today in the modern nation of Israel. Eusebius was a scholar who was interested in books. He seems to have had access to a lot of books, but he also liked thinking about books. So his history of the church is actually a history of Christian books. The book I wrote on Eusebius is about how he thinks about organizing a different set of books, the 4 Gospels of the Christian New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And when it comes to the Preparatio, or indeed to a lot of what Eusebius worked on, he's just as interested in sort of organizing the conceptual library that he has, as in making any particular arguments. He does have arguments. He has lots of opinions about everything. But he's really invested in organizing the conceptual library. Sometimes I think that reflects the actual books at his disposal, but it's also just this interest that Eusebius represents as a broader trend in this turn to late antiquity, as we might call the period, in organizing knowledge and using new technologies and new ways of thinking about information to organize ever-growing collections of knowledge. So that Preparatio project is this giant database of citations, structured around some central insights, but also just random stuff that he found interesting thrown in.
Right.
And this is an interesting project, in part because I think it tells us about what Eusebius is up to more broadly. He's not just making arguments. He's reading stuff and organizing it. I wonder if one of the ways to think about the Preparatio, for example, would be to compare another really big project of citation and collection. And what I'm talking about is Pliny the Elder's 1st century CE natural history. So Pliny tells us that he has read over 20,000 books and made over 200,000 notes. It's not entirely clear to me how big a note is in these terms, but Pliny's project is first of all about reading a bunch of stuff and extracting material that seems interesting, and then sort of shuffling it around to produce the work that is the natural history. There is clearly a logic to the natural history. Pliny designs this project as a way of giving you this sort of encyclopedic view of Roman Empire. But that's the skeleton. And inside the skeleton is all of this miscellaneous stuff that he's collected. Here I should say, and it's quite important, that Pliny's not doing this work alone. Pliny is relying on the labor of enslaved workers who do his physical work of reading and writing for him, and who we should assume are also involved in the cognitive work of creating knowledge. So Pliny's giant project isn't really just Pliny's. We also don't know about Eusebius. For Eusebius, it's possible that he just spent all of his time reading and writing. It seems like that's what he would have liked to do. But he was also a bishop, and he also had to do other stuff. And so we should keep in mind for Eusebius, just like for most other elite intellectuals in the past, these projects that are single authored, that have one name attached, are seldom really single authored projects. They're often actually the result of teams of collaborators. We don't know about the labor arrangements involved for Eusebius. We do know that his predecessor, Origen, 3/4 of a century earlier, relied on the work of enslaved secretaries to produce his intellectual output. We don't know about Eusebius. It's possible that he relied on enslaved workers. It's possible that he had collaborators with other financial relationships to him, hopefully less exploitative ones, but we really don't know. But I think it's always important when we're talking about these big projects of organizing and collecting knowledge in antiquity that we recognize they're often group efforts. They're almost always group efforts.
Yeah, because I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, because projects like that don't just get done with one person without like the internet. I mean, let's get real. Even with the internet, I don't think you were getting that done. Now, what is his relationship to the church as a bishop, as far as being a scholar at the same time? How does he is he like more focused on one side than the other, do you think, or is that hard to tell?
It's a bit hard to tell. Most of what we know about Eusebius is his own literary output, which is prodigious. He wrote a lot. We know far less about most of the other things Eusebius got up to. The day-to-day of what it meant for him to be a bishop in the seaside city of Caesarea, we really don't know. Well, I expect that he had. Oh, sorry. I expect he had to keep people happy. You don't stay bishop if people feel like you're not being a good bishop. But I don't know what that meant in practical terms. And I think we just don't have a lot of biography for him. We know he did some politicking, but mostly he wrote books, or at least most of what we know about him is that he wrote books. So it's hard to tell.
Yeah, that's true. Now, there's this common thing people talk about with Eusebius is that he's the guy that was the one who interpolated Josephus. And where does that come from? Or maybe do you think that's possible? What's the deal? What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have a strong answer. Eusebius generally doesn't interpolate stuff. So it would be unusual if he had. I don't think that we have good evidence suggesting that Eusebius did. However, this is part of what we just don't know. Certainly some Christian reader thought Josephus needed to say more Christian stuff. But I think our tendency to attribute that act of interpolation to Eusebius has more to do with the fact that Eusebius looms so large in our imagination of Christian literary activity in the period. We know that Eusebius had a lot of books and did a lot of writing, and oftentimes we attribute things that happened in the history of Christian books, or books being transmitted by Christians. By this point, Josephus is, for all intents and purposes, a Christian book in terms of its readership and transmission, even if not in its origins. So we know that Eusebius is important in the history of Christian literature and the books being transmitted and read by Christians, and so we sort of attribute things that happened to him. I don't think there's a good reason to do that, although I don't think we can rule it out. But this is also not a question I've spent an enormous amount of time on. So maybe there are details in the evidence that should push us toward thinking that he interpolated it. But given his general citation habits, I find that unlikely. And I find our desire to make Eusebius the one who did it somewhat suspect.
For someone who doesn't know what we would describe as the Eusebian Apparatus, what would you say about that?
I would say that we're all, or many of us, those of us who are interested in the history of Christian literature, are familiar with the fact that there are 4 Gospels that have different narratives, different structures, sometimes different material, but also that overlap. In modern terms, we often use cross-references to find our way around. You'll find in the margin or the footnote or sometimes in the inner column of a print Bible, you'll find a reference. This passage is paralleled in other Gospels at these references. Or scholars often use what's called a synopsis. A synopsis organizes material in parallel columns. Let's say we're talking about the baptism of Jesus. You'll have Matthew's baptism story in one column, and then next to it, you'll have Mark's baptism story, and then Luke's, and so forth. This lets you easily compare visually and see the similarities, see the differences. You can read down any narrative column and read the story as Matthew tells it, as Luke tells it, as Mark tells it. Or you can read across and compare. Modern readers aren't the first people to notice these relationships of similarity and difference. Eusebius created a tool that does the same kind of work. In fact, Eusebius's apparatus, his gospel apparatus, was the first system of cross-references ever designed by anyone for anything. Not just for the Gospels, but for anything. This is the first system of cross-references. So it's a technological innovation as well as a particular scholarly project for reading Gospels in particular. Eusebius designs a system, again, he's writing in the 4th century, he designs a system to help you read the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Those are the Gospels that Eusebius is interested in here. It helps you read those 4 Gospels together. It maps the places they're similar. It maps the ways they're different. And Eusebius does this to do real interpretive work. It's not as though parallels are always cut and dried. He's deciding what counts as similar and what counts as different. What things make sense to read together. And those are interpretive decisions. They're interpretive decisions that are made by modern scholars too. When modern scholars make gospel synopses and put texts in parallel, they're making decisions about what they think counts as parallel and what they think should be compared. And Eusebius is doing that same kind of scholarly work. He's comparing similar and noticing different, and he's asking questions about how we should understand the relationships between these 2 similar and yet dissimilar texts.
Now, that, because we do that today with trying to put together a Q, does he ever try to do something like that? Because I know Papias mentions there being a proto Matthew text. That is he trying to, or no, is that not even on his radar?
Yeah. So Eusebius doesn't seem interested in source criticism. That is to say, Eusebius is not primarily interested in figuring out how one gospel was made using material from another gospel, or from other sources for that matter. Having said that, Eusebius does have a queue of sorts. He divides the Gospels into 10 categories. Material that's shared by all 4 Gospels is Canon 1. Material that's just shared by the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, Luke, is Canon 2, and so forth. Canon 5 is material that is distinctively shared by Matthew and Luke. This is, after all, what we might in other terms call Q, right? Q is the material that's shared by Matthew and Luke that doesn't appear in Mark. And of course, modern scholars would finesse those parallels a little differently than Eusebius does. But the pattern of relationships that modern scholars understand as Q is a pattern of relationships that Eusebius makes visible. What he doesn't do is ask the source critical question. It seems like that's not on his radar. But I'm not sure that's because he would be uninterested in source criticism, so much as that he's doing a different kind of project here. He's interested in literary analysis. He's interested in noticing literary patterns and narrative structures and shared language and concepts structured in different ways in these 4 Gospels. And so just because he's not doing source criticism, I don't think means that he would have rejected source criticism.
Wow, that's interesting. A lot of people talk about Eusebius as someone who, kind of like Herodotus in a way, where a lot of the stuff he says is on point, but a lot of other stuff he says are questionable. I'll give you an example. There's a story in the church history of Peter, I think Peter and Mark, or just Peter, going to Alexandria to write the gospel, or yeah, I think he was with Mark, and they met Philo there or something, or was it? Wait, was it Peter? I can't remember who it was, but it's one of the, yeah, I think it was Peter. Met Philo. You might know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I could be butchering the whole thing, but people are like, I don't know if that happened. What are your thoughts on that? Or is this just common mistakes in this time period?
Right. Well, so I tend to think that Eusebius doesn't make stuff up, but that doesn't mean Eusebius is always right. Eusebius is a collector, and he collects things of various accuracy, and he knows the things he collects are of various accuracy. Some of the things he collects, he knows are not quite as certain as other things he collects, and sometimes he's willing to give things the benefit of the doubt or the benefit of inclusion, even when we might want to put a historical question mark on them. And we should be really grateful that Eusebius was like this, because what it means is that Eusebius is preserving for us not just one set of 4th century opinions, but an enormous trove of bits and pieces of early Christian thought. That doesn't mean I think that Eusebius is right about that. And Eusebius is working from a source here. I also don't think that Eusebius is the one who invented it. Eusebius tends not to interpolate, and he tends not to create out of whole cloth. What he does sometimes do, especially in polemical contexts, is leave out the bit that might disagree with him. But generally, Eusebius misleads by omission or elision rather than outright lying. And I think that especially when we come to sort of the conflicts that surround Christological controversies nearer to Eusebius's own day in the 4th century, that sometimes we should look critically and skeptically. But again, it's mostly about things he leaves out and doesn't say and lets you assume, and not about him making up sources. He loves documents. He loves collecting stuff out of his library. And I don't think he's inventing new documents. I do think that we need to be careful how we read what he gives us.
Yeah, that makes sense. He's hearing these stories, or he has some sort of source in front of him. He's just putting it in there. Makes sense. What is his relationship with Constantine? What is that like?
Yeah, so there is a scholarly back and forth on this. So I have an opinion, but there are other opinions out there. My take is that Eusebius's relationship with Constantine is much less tight or close than has been suggested in these sort of Eusebius and empire narratives. We don't see a lot of evidence for that. What we see is that Eusebius gives a couple of big speeches. Well, that could mean that he's the court theologian of Constantine, as has been suggested, but I don't think that's a great explanation, especially because Eusebius has another day job. And in his entire life, he probably sees Eusebius probably sees Constantine twice or 3 times. So yeah, he writes some stuff. He writes a speech in praise of Constantine, and the thing that has most given him the reputation of being a sort of court toady is his Life of Constantine. Now, of course, the thing is, Constantine is dead when Eusebius writes the Life of Constantine.
Oh, okay.
And it's a posthumous text. And one way of understanding it could be that Eusebius really loved Constantine and wanted to sort of praise him to the skies. Another way of understanding it, one which I'm partial to, is thinking that this isn't so much a text about Constantine as it is a text about Constantine's sons. In other words, your dad was great. Let me tell you the things about your dad that were great that we should, keep in mind. Be like your dad. And so the very Christian Constantine, the very church-loving, pious Constantine, who let the church manage its own affairs and kept the peace and didn't give bishops a hard time, or didn't give the right sorts of bishops like Eusebius a hard time. This Constantine may be just as much a political fiction, not about Constantine really, but about the next direction that the empire was going to take. I'm not alone in reading that. Here I follow, for example, Michael Hollerich. But I think that we need to be careful in how we read the Life of Constantine. What's it actually about? Is it that Eusebius himself is tightly connected to the empire and to imperial power? Or is this what in the Renaissance we would call a mirror for princes? Sort of a way of suggesting a political theology that isn't so much about Constantine or the relationship between Eusebius and Constantine, and is more about both how the new political powers should relate to Christianity, and also maybe about how other Christian figures like Eusebius in similar positions of Christian leadership might think about communicating with and positioning themselves vis-a-vis imperial power.
This is such a fascinating time period for history. Now, what do other scholars who oppose you on that say? Do they say it's a lot closer?
Yeah, I mean, this is a standard position that goes back to the beginning of the 20th century, in ways even before that, but especially associated with figures like Adolf von Harnack, who we should say thought of himself as being somewhat like Eusebius. And Adolf von Harnack was the court theologian to Kaiser Wilhelm II. There's a bit of autobiography in that portrait. Now, I don't think we can reject it just because of that.
Sure.
But there is a reason to be skeptical about that too tidy connection between sort of the court theologian and the emperor. But yes, yeah, some scholars see a tighter relationship. I'm skeptical. There are folks like James Cork Webster in London and Timothy Barnes up in Edinburgh who've written really interesting work on this, taking slightly different positions from each other. David DeVore out here in California also has a book coming out very soon that addresses this set of questions. So there are other folks to read here who are really interested in the questions of Eusebius's political theology. But I think on the whole, scholars are more interested now in the question of how pro-Roman Empire, how pro-Constantinian regime Eusebius is. And is he critical? Is he, sort of all in? And everyone has taken at least something of a step back on the close personal and professional relationship between Eusebius and Constantine.
Now, you mentioned that he was writing this after Constantine died. How far along does Eusebius survive? Does it just go into his sons? Does he go past the sons? Does he go to how far does he go to Julian? Or that's way back.
No, that's way too late. Yeah, no, Eusebius only lives a couple of years after Constantine does. So this is very immediately posthumous.
Yeah, I see.
And it may have been started before Constantine was all the way dead. It seems to be written and distributed after his death, but it may be a project that is prepared with that imminent end in mind. Constantine's sons do not get along. It's a bit of a turbulent period.
Yeah.
And so it's not hard to imagine that as Constantine was evidently declining, that Eusebius might have already been turning his mind to this project.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I know during this time period, it seems like the presence of Neoplatonists are still pretty strong. Yeah. Is he ever engaged in debates with these people at all?
Well, we don't know. So he knows Porphyry's writings.
Yeah.
And it's easy to imagine that he and Porphyry could have actually been in the same place at the same time. But we don't know. We just don't know.
Yeah.
Certainly he knows Neoplatonist writings. He has a couple of bits of Plotinus. He knows Porphyry. He connects back to Origen, of course. He doesn't have any direct personal connection with Origen, but he sees Origen as sort of the exemplary figure after whom he's modeling himself. And Origen seems to have a close connection with these early Neoplatonist circles in the early to mid 3rd century CE. So we have most of a century before Eusebius. All this to say, yeah, there are the number of degrees of separation are small. You could play far less than 7 degrees of separation and get from Eusebius to these key Neoplatonist figures. But whether they're actually directly connecting is harder to demonstrate. And yet it's also clear that Eusebius knows the literature that's being produced by these figures. He knows figures like Plotinus and Porphyry. And he knows others as well, sort of figures like Iamblichus.
Wow, that's interesting. My next question was, when he's putting together these texts that are encyclopedic by nature, like preparation, for example, it seems like he's trying to put these stories in there as and I want to get your thoughts on this. Is he trying to say like some of these texts are pointing to Jesus?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So what does he mean? Does he mean that their authors are trying to point to Jesus? No. Does he think that these texts reflect the divine wisdom that is manifested in Jesus? Yes. So Eusebius believes in some form of divine logos that's spread throughout creation. So the divine truth or word or reason that is scattered, spread. The language we use for this is the spermatic logos. So it's been sown or planted. That is sort of all throughout history and all throughout human culture, imperfectly. And so this is part of a broader argument that sees all of human history and culture as manifesting a sort of divine teleology that leads toward Jesus and toward Christian truth and wisdom.
That's fascinating because you have this text about this really ancient priest named Sancho Niethan from, they claim, 13th century BCE. Like, whoa, that's way back. Who knows if that's true or not? Because it seems to have a euhemerus slant in there, where these gods like Saturn is actually a king on Earth. But regardless of any of that stuff, like who knows about that? That's not even beside the point. The text when I'm reading it, Saturn sacrificing his only son to Father Ouranos in heaven, and I'm like, whoa, that sounds familiar. And I'm wondering, is Eusebius seeing what I'm seeing, and he's seeing, wow, a lot of these pagan texts, not just the Jewish texts, are leading up to the Christ. Is that? I mean, I wonder if that's what he's trying to do. It seems pretty legit, you know?
Yeah. No, and connecting Agamemnon's sacrifice of his daughter with Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac as well. Yeah, no, these sorts of connections are noted by figures like Eusebius. They're even noted by non-Christians in the period who often will want to put the arrow of dependence the other way and say, oh, yeah, Jewish literature, Christian literature is borrowing from Homer, is borrowing from Greek literature. So yeah, recognizing these sorts of parallels and the impulse to see parallels whenever possible.
Right.
There's a sort of anthropological theory here, we might say. A way of understanding human culture as, in important ways, fundamentally shared, such that you should expect to find parallels and echoes. And then this makes it worthwhile to go and look for parallels and echoes. So this is not something that just Eusebius is up to. Eusebius is up to it, other Christians are up to it, but it's a broader phenomenon of sort of this imperial mode of knowledge in late antiquity, and really already with sort of the early empire as well. As Rome's empire expands, there's this really fascinating cultural project of trying to organize the histories, cultures, including cults, and literatures of these various peoples into some sort of systematic imperial way of knowing, and to structure this into a coherent possibility of shared knowledge. So we see this, it's often called Roman antiquarianism or Roman encyclopedism. And we see this also in early Christians. But I always want to, there are things that make early Christians in particular interesting, but oftentimes the things that we happen to find interesting about early Christians are ways that those Christians are putting their own twist on something that's actually part of a broader set of cultural developments. And Eusebius, in some ways, is an innovator, especially in terms of technology and his cross-references, his interest in using tables to organize information, for example. And yet Eusebius's interest in collecting knowledge is not new, and it's not singular, although he's really influential in how he does it and does some really interesting things in the way he does it. He's part of this bigger landscape.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think he said something along the lines of the mystical rites of the Phoenicians predicted that there will be a only son who will take on the sins of mankind. And I'm reading this and I'm like, wow, this guy sees the world in this really fascinating way, where he really sees this as the universal church, which was does that term Catholic where does that term is that, are we seeing that in his time period, or is that later?
Yeah, well, the word doesn't mean what it means to us, but yes. So Catholic or Catholicos means universal or complete, according to the whole. It can be used in mundane senses that don't have the sort of theological freight that the word Catholic does for later Christian traditions. Most figures in Eusebius's day would not talk about themselves as Catholic. That's not yet a descriptor. But there are things that are shared or universal, and the language of katholos, according to the whole, does appear for that. So I think you're right to see that connection, but the language isn't doing quite what it does later.
Now, with I'm trying to put my timeline together in my head, but you might be able to do this better for me, because when we have, by the time we have the canon set, what's up with what happens to the other texts? Does Eusebius ever talk about the other texts, or does he not like them? Does he like them? What's the deal with that?
Well, so Eusebius likes books, and he likes to show off as well. So he likes not only to have books and study books, but also to tell you about all the books he has and has seen. Like many other early Christian figures, Eusebius has sort of a multiple layered way of thinking about sacred books. There are some books that Eusebius regards, and I don't think he's innovating this, there's some books that Eusebius regards as authoritative for his Christian community. There are only 4 Gospels in that category. There are other books that Eusebius recognizes that some Christians use and some Christians don't. And he is interested in those debates about sort of liminal books, books that some people find useful, some people don't, some people have authorship questions, some people just think they're really, really weird. The Apocalypse of John is a weird book, the book of Revelation. It's a weird book, and there are debates about, well, what do you do with this weird book? So there are other books that there are debates about, and Eusebius is willing to flag the debates and say, well, there are debates about this book, some keep it, some don't, and he's not kicking it out. He's just saying, well, here's where we stand. There are other books that he rejects. Some of these are books that are accepted by other Christian groups with very different libraries, with very, very different social structures than the church that he leads. And he has objections to these books. But there are also books that Eusebius doesn't regard as scripture, but he still finds useful. And so Eusebius is, and again, Eusebius is not alone on this. He's willing to say there are other books that some people use that are interesting, that provide often supplemental information. We could talk about these as like supplemental scriptures, or maybe lowercase s there. They are scriptural in some sense. They fit into this scriptural landscape, but they're not part of the formal set of books, which still has fuzzy edges in any case. They're not part of the books that you would read in church, but also they're useful. Francois Bavon, the fantastic historian of early Christianity who passed away a few years ago, would talk about these as a third category. Books that are useful for the soul. Nobody thinks they're scripture, or most people don't think they're scripture at least. They're also not deemed heretical or contested in that way. They're just these other category of books. Books that you can use for scholarship, for piety, for reading because they're interesting, but that sort of occupy this liminal space. We can think about this as concentric circles. Sort of you got your most central books in the middle and then multiple circles going outward. And so I think oftentimes we have sort of reductive histories of canon. We sort of talk about canon as if people have one big fight and some books are in, some books are out, and you read only the books that are in and you never read the books that are out.
Right.
And that's not true in many ways. But one of the ways here is that I think what we actually see is this long process of people, different groups, different individuals in different groups, preferring different books and using different books in different ways. And canon is sometimes a secondary conversation. Like, these are the books we read in church. These are some other books we have in our library. These are some books that we find sort of weird. These are some books we don't know what to do with. And canon is a second order discourse. Canon is the way of sort of making into a list the book practices of your group. Canon can be contestational. It can be rejecting the book practices of some other group. But canon isn't as though people sat down and said, let's just pick some books. No, canon lists, canon making, canon discourses are about well, what books do we read and what books do we find central and important? And it's a sort of secondary process to the actual process of using books. But again, not everybody uses the same books. And so in that sense, canon is often quite polemical, but it's still secondary to using books. And Eusebius is smack dab in the middle of that process.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, was he there? Was he part of the decision to put together this collection?
Yeah, well, I mean, the whole putting together of a collection is such a slow process that it's hard to even say when and where and how does that happen. So no, Eusebius is not sort of making a canon. There's no sense in which Eusebius is making a canon. There is a sense in which Eusebius gives us some of our first evidence for how people like Eusebius thought about organizing their library. And he's fantastic evidence, but he's evidence. He's not making the canon. The canon isn't made in that sort of way at all. But he's evidence for how people like Eusebius organize their libraries. And Eusebius might be a bit weird. He seems to disagree with other figures in the 4th century, but they're still trying to organize the library, not sort of invent the canon.
So let me try to think this out in an analogous way, because you have these writers like Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, Hippolytus, and Epiphanius, and they come way before Eusebius, but they're writing about heresies, what they don't think is right, based on maybe what Paul says or what Jesus says, but they have their reasons for calling things heresy and calling things not. By the time we get to Eusebius, these things are already sort of materializing, and like it's not like one person's choosing, but like this is already the thing. Would that make sense?
Yeah. No, and so of those figures, Epiphanius is in a sort of different bucket, because Epiphanius comes after Eusebius. And Epiphanius is actually a bookish person, very much like Eusebius. He's both like and utterly unlike Eusebius. He probably would have hated Eusebius, but he also is a lot like Eusebius. But yeah, these other figures. So but what's interesting is that someone like Irenaeus has really strong theological opinions. And he has this thing that he calls the rule of faith. You're either, following my rule of faith or you're not. And, if you're not, you're a heretic.
Mm-hmm.
But while it is pretty clear that Irenaeus is a constructive theological thinker who is structuring what he believes into new ways of expressing it, he doesn't think he's inventing the rule of faith. And I don't think he is, strictly speaking. He is concretizing what he takes to be the tradition that he's part of. Other people would understand that tradition differently and would concretize it differently. But Irenaeus is not trying to invent a rule of faith. Rather, he's trying to express what he takes to be the central set of theological concepts for the group he's already part of. Obviously, that does exclude people who are not part of that group, who are working who are on a different trajectory, or who are on a trajectory where it's branched off. But like with canon, this rule of faith idea, it's really about sort of concretizing the trajectory one takes oneself to be in already, the practices and ideas of one's group. Does that make sense in answer to your question?
That does make sense, yeah. And so, yeah, that does. I mean, because I'm very fascinated about these early Christian diversities, and the Nacenes, the Sethians, and the different groups like the Valentinians, and I've always been wondering what it is about them that doesn't necessarily gel with the people coming later, or what happens to those texts, and I'm just I guess but you're making it. I think what you're saying is by the time we get to Eusebius, it's sort of it's not people choosing those books. It's sort of like those are the more popular books. Those are the ones that people are more attracted to at that point.
Yeah, well, and within sort of social contexts.
Yeah.
So it's not as though people are sort of coming to this de novo. Some Christian groups have sort of developed their textual practices, their scriptural corpora, their liturgical practices in particular ways, and other groups in different ways. But once you're sort of in that sociology, you're in a group that already is what we might call a textual community. Within a given textual community, there are texts that are more and less central. And, if people within Eusebius's textual community happen to really spend a lot of time, like spending a lot of time reading the book of Revelation, that's fine. That doesn't put them outside the textual community, but it doesn't make that the center of gravity either.
It makes sense.
And it is unfortunate for us as historians of Christianity that we don't have, say, the Valentinian Eusebius. I don't think there was such a figure, but like, you know, a similar figure organizing the world of Christian literature and Christian thought and Christian history in the 4th century from a perspective that's quite different. So I don't want to say that Eusebius's take on Christianity is universal, but I also think it's really important to say that he's not inventing this thing out of whole cloth. And this is not as though he's just imposing something by episcopal decree on the church. That's not how things worked.
I got you.
And yet there are other groups. There are other groups that have play by their own rules and do their own thing. And we just don't have as much evidence for some of those groups. And it would be so fun if we did.
Yeah, it really would be. Now, what can we say about Eusebius as far as his methods that changed the game in scholarship, especially Christian scholarship?
Yeah, so Eusebius is a mega citer. If you read the demonstration or the preparation for the gospel or the church history, an enormous proportion of it is documents that Eusebius didn't write. And a substantial portion of the rest of it is lists of, and he wrote books on so and 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 so. The amount of citation involved is enormous. And that mode of citational history takes off and becomes a part of subsequent historiography as well. It's not that other people didn't already collect sources and cite them, but doing history so fundamentally by citation was an influential move. There's also another Eusebian project, one that gets a lot less airtime. It's called the Chronicle or the Chronicon. Now, this project used tables, sort of columns and rows, to organize world history. Each column collected data for a different literary corpus or empire or history. So, you know, you have a Babylonian column, a column for the history of the Jews and of Israel. You'd have a column eventually for Alexander's empires and the post-Alexandrian empires. And eventually all of this converges into a single column of Christian Roman history. So there's a teleology to the information structure where many columns come down to one column that is sort of the end point of history for Eusebius.
Do we
but also technically, sorry.
Do we still have this?
Sort of.
Okay.
So Eusebius did this in Greek. We don't really have it in Greek, but we do have Jerome's translation into Latin, and we have a translation into Armenian.
Wow.
The Armenian is a lot of fun. It preserves more of Eusebius's project than Jerome's translation did. The Armenian is also understudied, so if anyone watching this wants to learn classical Armenian, which is a lot of fun to learn as well, and then spend more time on the Chronicon, that would be great.
Wow.
Not enough people, so there's just brief parenthetical plug for classical Armenian. So many really interesting early Christian sources are preserved not in Greek or in Latin or even in Syriac, but in Armenian.
Wow.
But not as many people read Armenian, and not as many modern scholars read Armenian. And so as a result, a lot of these things get understudied. There's so much cool stuff in the Madnaran, the big library in Armenia. There are so many manuscripts that have not fully been studied. And certainly the librarians and archivists there know they have cool stuff, but they don't have, 1,000 lifetimes to study each cool thing they have the way it might deserve. So if you're interested in the history of early Christianity, learn Armenian. Yeah. And you can study all sorts of cool understudied stuff. You can be the first person to write on an important early Christian text in, 300, 400 years, because there's so much cool stuff that just hasn't been studied properly.
That's, and I'm gonna go back to what I cut you off with Eusebius. We'll go back to that 1 second, but I just want to mention this because it's so we like to think of ourselves in this day and age in the internet that we have all the books now. Everything's on the internet. You can find. It's like there's some work to be done.
Oh yeah.
And the more I talk to people like you and other scholars like I'm David Litwa, the more I'm realizing that people are still translating texts that need to be translated. And there's stuff we might find a diamond in the rough somewhere. Who knows?
Yeah.
So just want to throw that out there for the listeners who are maybe Armenian by now. Who knows?
Yeah, no. And Again, Armenian is not that hard to learn, and it's fun. It's work for your brain, but it's fun. Yeah, so the Chronicon goes two directions. One way goes to Armenian. There's a robust manuscript tradition. More work needs to be done there, but some work has been done. The other direction is to Latin by way of Jerome. Jerome writes it. He also extends it. Jerome's version becomes standard in the Latin West and Latin Europe, and it gets recycled and added to and adapted for other sorts of history. And so this project of Eusebius is incredibly influential, both in terms of the content and the theological theory undergirding its organization, but also in terms of the technology proper, the using of columns to organize parallel sources and sort of making a timeline, essentially. And it's an incredibly influential project that again starts with citations, starts with collecting sources, and uses the table as a technology for sorting that information out. I have an article that'll come out, open access, so completely free, in about a month with the German publisher De Gruyter, that's on how these sorts of tables work. So one of the cool things about a table is that it's a tool for collaboration. If you set up sort of your grid columns and rows, then it means more than one person can fill in the table, can add in the information. And this seems to be what was going on in a number of table-based projects. We see this for Origen of Alexandria with his big hexapla, which was a giant text critical project in the 3rd century. It was a really, really important way of comparing the Hebrew texts of the Jewish scriptures with their various Greek translations. And to do this, Origen and his unnamed collaborators used a giant table with columns and rows. And what that means is people can work together in filling it out. The table, as a technology, facilitates dividing up the labor and coordinating the information. The same thing seems to be going on in Eusebius's project, where it's probably not just Eusebius. It's probably Eusebius and any number of unnamed collaborators filling out this giant data set that's structured with a table.
Wow. Now that is interesting. That seems like it's like a game changer in a way, where now there's a method we can use to just categorize these books in a way. And I'm now that you mentioned it, I'm really interested to go check out that table of the periods from Babylonian to I would love to look at that, because Eusebius is a very fascinating writer. I'm not gonna lie, I really enjoy reading his stuff, even though it's a lot of citations. But that's what I like about him, because he's taking you in like a time machine. He's like, here, this is what this guy said. Here's what this guy said, and I'm like, oh, this is the kind of stuff I like to read. This might be my last question. In your preface, you talk about Ammonius the Alexandrian.
Yeah.
And this might be out of your wheelhouse, maybe not. But lately, I've been seeing this name pop up everywhere, and pagans and Origen. Is this the same guy that taught Origen? What's the deal with that?
Okay, there's a debate on this. Is there one Ammonius? Are there two? I lean toward one being the most elegant solution. I'm not dead set on it being the necessary solution, but it seems like the most elegant solution to explain all of the data well. There's a big debate on this. Ammonius is really interesting because everybody agrees, isn't primarily an author. He's a teacher. He teaches. He's remembered as the teacher of Origen. He's remembered as the teacher of Plotinus. He's said to produce a work that's on the agreement of Jesus and Moses, and he's said to produce a gospel parallel. What exactly he did is hard to tell. And Eusebius's Epistle to Carpianus, which I put at the beginning of my book, is his instruction letter and justification for why he's created the system of gospel cross-references. The distinguishing feature of Eusebius's gospel cross-references is that because they're cross-references coordinated by some section numbers in the margins and then a set of coordinating cross-reference tables at the front of the manuscript, that means that the individual gospels still run in order. So Matthew, you can read from start to end. Mark, you can read from start to end. Luke, start to end. John, likewise. That's not what Ammonius did. Ammonius made something that's more like our modern synopses. So my modern four gospel synopsis, which is behind me on the bookshelf, has rearranged the material so that you can read in order. And it still follows a roughly biographical organization, but it doesn't directly follow the sequence of any one gospel. It seems like what Ammonius did is he set up column A, shall we say, with Matthew. Matthew ran in order. And then everything else was arranged wherever it went alongside Matthew. What that means is that the other Gospels were out of order in their own terms. Eusebius's complaint is Ammonius has divided up and dissolved the literary unity of these Gospels in order to aid the comparative project. But I will use technology to do both things, to both do the comparison that Ammonius is doing, but also to maintain the literary integrity so you can engage in literary modes of reading that require narrative, coherence, and structure. That's Eusebius's technological invention.
Wow.
What's harder to know is exactly how much he took from Ammonius. So had Ammonius basically done all of the work of identifying what counts as similar and what counts as different, and then Eusebius just reconfigures that technologically? Or does Eusebius sort of take the invitation to do the work of comparing, but does he do some of his own distinctive work in deciding what counts as similar and what counts as different? I lean toward the latter, in part because it seems like some of the features of Eusebius's project can't be explained just by deriving from Ammonius's project of comparison. So, for example, if Ammonius's project is structured around Matthew, what does that mean about material that's shared, say, just by Luke and John? Eusebius has a category for this. He identifies material in that category. But if you've structured something just around Matthew, that means only the stuff that corresponds to Matthew will fit, right? And so Eusebius is clearly doing creative and comparative work that doesn't fit within the scope of Ammonius's project. And that makes me think that Eusebius has taken the impetus or the invitation to this project from Ammonius, but is actually doing a substantial amount of work on his own, not just in terms of technology, but also in terms of textual analysis. Going back to Ammonius, though, where we started your question, and I'm sorry that was a bit of a digression.
No, that was
Ammonius seems to be sort of this central imagined figure for a number of different communities of broadly Platonist intellectuals in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Eusebius is doing something by locating his own scholarship in the trajectory of this remembered figure, Ammonius. He's locating himself in a scholarly network, in a scholarly landscape, in a scholarly tradition. One that includes Plotinus and Porphyry, that also connects Eusebius again to Origen, who he thinks of so highly. That also connects him to Iamblichus. And he's locating himself in a particular intellectual landscape of people with philosophical and literary interests. And I think that's worth noting, that whatever exactly Ammonius's project looked like that Eusebius had in front of him, Eusebius, by mentioning that project, which is otherwise not extant and otherwise not known to anybody. The only people who know about Ammonius's gospel parallel project are people who have Eusebius's letter that I translated in my book. Everyone else seems not to know it unless they're using Eusebius to get to it. But by locating his own scholarship in this trajectory that starts with Ammonius, he's actually doing a different kind of work as well in positioning himself as a scholar.
Wow, that's fascinating. It seems like there's like this, it almost seems like there's this, he's like a sage that doesn't care about Christianity versus Neoplatonism. I'm just a scholar. Like, I'm everything. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, well, I think that Eusebius would say, well, if you get the Platonism right, you'll be a Christian.
Yeah. Nice.
And so obviously not all Neoplatonists are going to buy that. But Eusebius's take is that, if you get Plato right, you'll read Plato, well, like Eusebius, you'll read him Christianly, and then everything will work out nicely.
That's actually not a impossible take, in my opinion, because a lot of the things the Platonists are talking about sort of align with things the Christians are talking about,
Yeah, well, I mean, it's going to involve, it's necessarily going to involve having a particular take on how to read the Platonic tradition. But that doesn't mean that it's a bad way to do a Platonic tradition. In fact, everyone in this period has a take on how to do the Platonic tradition. And there are many ways in which Eusebius is doing that in ways that are closely aligned with figures like Iamblichus and Plotinus, even as he has his own particular interests.
I think it was the last pope before this one, or maybe the current pope, that said that Platonism and Christianity are now holding hands as they should be. Something along those lines.
That sounds more like Benedict the 16th.
Yeah, Benedict,
yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't heard that line, but that's interesting.
Yeah, it sort of makes sense to what we were talking about. I don't know. It could have maybe
Yeah.
maybe it's all coming full circle now. You know,
I mean, so I'll say, there's a contemporary movement, theological and philosophical, called Christian Platonism, which aims to think about Christian theology in explicitly Platonist terms. There also are modern Christian theological takes on Aristotle as sort of the key to thinking through Christian theology. I'll just say that both aspects are long parts of the Christian tradition in its various corners and directions. Thomas Aquinas is on that Aristotelian end.
yeah.
Figures like Origen or Eusebius are on the Platonist end, although they're also sort of synthetic figures who are bringing together material from different and somewhat eclectic directions. Yeah. So I guess I would say you don't have to pick one or the other, but as a historian, you have to recognize that these are both parts of the conversation and have been for a really long time.
Yeah, and I don't know how much you get into the early Christian sects and denominations that became heresy later, but Dr. M. David Little points this out, that there was a group called the Carpocratians who were in Alexandria, and they not only had a statue of Jesus, they also had statues of Pythagoras and Plato, according to what we got passed down from Hippolytus. Now that would be interesting, because this is like full-blown Christian Platonism happening early on, you know?
Yeah, well, and it seems like it's a cultic take on Christian Platonism, which is very interesting.
Yeah,
I recently read David's new book on the Carpocratians, which is quite fascinating. I think as often, David and I disagree a little bit, but
sure.
also I think he's doing really interesting work in drawing together and chasing down sources that we should be reading as clusters and thinking about, and often just don't pay enough attention to. But yeah, I think that that's a really interesting way of getting at this broader question of where is Plato in the early Christian imagination?
Yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, I just want to point out your book, Eusebius the Evangelist, rewriting the Fourfold Gospel in Late Antiquity. And this book is on Amazon. I have a link in the description. Check it out. I recommend it. It was a very, very fascinating read, in my opinion, and to the point that I, immediately reached out to you and wanted to get you on, because it was such a good book. So I recommend it. Check it out. Links in the description. Also, you can follow him on Twitter. Link's in the description as well. So go and check him out on Twitter. And any last thoughts for us?
Just thanks so much for having me on. This has been so much fun.
I really appreciate it. Thank you for your time. And you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.